And here we go, psychology of motivation. Let us talk a little bit about physiological needs, and you're going to see we're going to go through a bunch of different need states. One of our main goals is to give examples of physiological needs, how they operate kind of in general and specifically, depending on the physiological need. Also is to differentiate these from motivations. So needs, drives, motives are going to take on a different flavor. Now, are there perfect boundaries between these categories? Probably not. What do you think, Penelope? Kind of fuzzy boundaries. Kind of like you, kind of fuzzy, right? And some of the boundaries are a little soft, but Penelope's all being wacky right now, so I see Hannah down here. What are you doing, Hannah? Huh? Hannah! Okay. All right, so physiological needs, let's get busy. So this represents lecture 4. What do you think? What's the odds of there's an assignment embedded in this lecture? If you think yes, hang on to the end or fast forward to the end, whichever way you want to approach it. And there you go. So because there will be a homework assignment described in this as well. So a need, any condition within the person that's essential for necessary life growth and or well-being, right? So we can see that that's kind of a broad conceptualization of needs. Everything from I need it, to maintain my life to it will enhance my psychological well-being or my growth motives. So when needs are nurtured and satisfied, well-being is maintained and enhanced. Okay? If neglected or frustrated, the needs thwarting will produce damage that disrupts biological or psychological well-being. And now, think about this, because one thing that I know many of you probably have on your life plan is becoming parents. So to what extent are you going to meet a child's needs, right, to nurture and satisfy your child, right? To what extent might you fall short? And but notice we can take this to an employment context as well. To what extent do your employees, do you meet their needs, right, and leave them feeling fulfilled, nurtured, satisfied? To what extent do they are they thwarted, right, and have biological or psychological challenges to their well-being? From this, though, motivational states therefore provide the impetus to act before damage occurs. So the relationship of need could be kind of the signal, hey, you need this, and then it's up to that to create a motivation to fulfill that need before the need becomes too devastating. Now, the need structure, type of need, well, we're going to talk about physiological needs in this particular lecture. So here we are at lecture 4. We're going to talk thirst, hunger, and sex. And these are inherent, workings within the biological structure or biological system. Now, psychological needs, this is going to be explored in chapter 6. This is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. A lot to say on those. I think lecture 6 is a fascinating lecture. And then finally, the implicit or social needs. And this comes to us in chapter 7, and this is achievement, affiliation, intimacy, and power. So that's what lays ahead of us. Chapter 5 will remain a mystery, not necessarily directly tied to this as well. So let's compare the effects of needs. Needs operate to prevent the damage to the bodily need, right? Bodily needs relate directly to the physical self. I mean, it's that simple. It's that straightforward, right? And they operate quite similarly for most people. So what we learn in this regard about Joe will apply to Sally necessarily. Psychological needs may be more or less universal, and that's, I think, what makes chapter 6 so interesting. This is pretty straightforward and gives us a really good picture of homeostasis and a lot of mechanisms like that. Psychological needs present a far more complex playing field for us to theorize, hypothesize, and then empirically demonstrate the success of our hypotheses. So, psychological needs such as autonomy or competence are likely present in most people, but not necessarily all people. Fascinating. Implicit needs are tied more to personal experience and thus vary to a great extent, and we'll be looking at those more strongly in then chapter 7. But compare as well, right? Needs that generate motivation from a perceived deficiency are more obvious and are more easily tied to the state of deprivation. So these are kind of straightforward, right? So they generate motivation. I'm hungry. I need to eat, right? And then it thus motivates us in a very direct fashion. Growth needs like self-actualization and what, let's say we have this need to self-actualize, to become who we are, so to speak, in Maslowian terms, right? How these needs translate to motives is a far less specific manner. It operates far more subtly. This division leads to two different emotional experiences, generally negative versus positive emotional states. And boy, that's a mouthful when you say negative versus positive emotions. I'm more, I like the way this is written, negative versus positive emotional states. But some of us don't like to think in terms or talk in terms or theorize in terms of negative versus positive emotions. Some of us are more action-oriented in the emotion field. I myself am one, and I think more in terms of describing emotions as the resultant desire to approach or to avoid or to remain stationary. But notice, approach and avoid, I think, are the important concepts, because I approach a stimulus or I avoid a stimulus often based on my perceived motivational characteristics of that stimulus. So, physiological needs then, inherent within the workings of biological systems. Thirst. What do we know? Thirst is the consciously experienced motivational state that readies the person to perform behaviors necessary to replenish a water deficit. I know, that's a really fancy-ass way of saying I'm thirsty and I need something to drink. Right? We'll get into more detail on how that operates. Right? Hunger. Right? Hunger and eating involve a complex regulatory system of both short-term and long-term. So both the glucostatic and lipostatic hypothesis become central to this, right? Including set point theory regulations. So thirst, relatively straightforward comparatively. Hunger becomes more complex, and we'll see as we move through it. And then sex, right? Sexual motivation rises and falls in response to a host of factors, right? Including hormones, external stimulation, external cues, maybe like facial metrics as an example, cognitive scripts, sexual schemas, and evolutionary process. So there's no simple story to tell about sexual drives, sexual motivations, if you will. All right? So, the physiological need, the psychological drive, the behavioral action process, what can we see? Well, let's start at the top. Number one, we have a satiated state. Satiation means I'm satisfied, right? So there might have been a need just present. I was a little thirsty, and I needed a little pick-me-up, right? So that represented itself as, the experience of thirst. And what does that mean? Well, have something to drink. And upon drinking, then I say, I'm good right now. I don't need to drink anymore. I've entered into that satiated state. Now, from the satiated state, too, is the physiological deprivation that develops gradually. And you'll notice that when people are lecturing, they often drink a lot. Why? Because as we lecture, we're expelling moisture. So we're removing moisture for the system. The system is experiencing that in terms of thirst over time, and we need to replenish. And that's why you see lectures with their water bottle or their coffee cup or what have you. All right? Now, when we go to 3, as we start to gradually, right, experience this deprivation, prolonged physiological deprivation produces the bodily need. So this is the actual sensation. Boy, I'm thirsty. Boy, I'm hungry. Whatever it is. And the need then intensifies and eventually yields a psychological drive. So it's that deprivation that causes us to when we psychologically acknowledge it, then it begins the system of motivation to take place. This goal-directed motivated behavior occurs as an attempt to gratify the drive. And note, this is largely learned through experience. The consumatory behavior occurs as a result of this drive. Boy, I'm really thirsty, so now I'll drink, right? And then the drive becomes reduced because satiation is supplanting the drive. And we eventually enter into the satiated state. Now, how thirsty might then dictate how much water we consume and how much water it diminish the drive state and reach satiation. So, The cyclical pattern depicting the rise and fall of the psychological drive then involves 7 core processes. So it begins with the need, which is the physiological, right? That is translated into the drive, the psychological. This is within the realm of homeostasis, that is creating a balance, right? Negative feedback then is the diminishing of the drive, and then multiple inputs, multiple outputs. We can talk about intra-organismic mechanisms. It's a good day when I pronounce organismic correct on the first time. And the extraorganismic mechanisms. So let's contrast a drive versus a need in this regard. As previously described, a need will arrive from a physical deficit, from imbalance to life-threatening emergencies. Right? And the drive is psychological, not biological. So let us consider then the need as more biological and the drive as more psychological. It represents the conscious manifestation of the underlying physiological need. So drive then in this conversation becomes the intervening variable. Right? So antecedent conditions. These antecedent is just a fancy-ass word for what sets the stage, what comes before. So we can have any number of antecedent conditions, like I haven't had anything to drink for quite a while. I'm lecturing and releasing my moisture. I had something salty for lunch, right? So if we combine these 3 antecedent conditions, this is where the action is with the drive, right? This is where I come to recognize that I'm thirsty. This generates then the behavioral consequence. And it can be a series of behaviors or a relatively simple behavior, or it can be behavioral chaining. In this case, the behavioral consequence, is I become thirsty, so I want to drink, right? So it might say, boy, I better, break this lecture. I'm going to pause. I'm going to go find something to drink. So I got to go downstairs, right? So it plays out in that manner. Questions about that? So the need is experienced as a psychological drive, and the drive then leads to the behavioral consequence or the action to take place, right? Now, the intensity of the level of the drive explains the observed output and is the motivation. So to what extent, how, it's like, God, I'm thirsty, but I only have, 3 more slides to go, I can make it, right? Whereas I am so thirsty, I have to stop now and get a drink, would be the terms of the intensity. So let's look at these intra and extraorganismic divisions here. The intraorganismic, which means inside the organism, is the biological regulatory systems that involve thirst in this example, right? So the hypothalamus is testing the content of the blood, and the hypothalamus is giving information about the blood quality, right? The glucose and insulin hormones in the endocrine system might be part of this as well, especially when we talk about eating. The stomach, liver, pancreas, the bodily organs have a voice in this as well. So what we see is all these systems can then assess the level of need, and they present to the brain the level of need, which is then converted to the psychological drive. Now, extraorganismic variables could be like environmental influences, and that is aspects of the environment might serve to make us thirstier. That is, if it's hot and it's dry, right? These then function to create thirst more quickly and at greater intensity. So it could be the cognitive knowledge of the calorie content. It could be the environmental time of day, the smell of food. Have you ever not been hungry and then all of a sudden you smell food and you go, oh my God, I didn't realize I'm so hungry. Now I'm hungry. That this in fact then added to the motivational quality of the drive. Social, the pressure of others. Here, have something to drink. Here, you look like you need something to drink, right? Okay. Or maybe it's cultural, the desirability of a given body shape, and saying, I'm hungry, but I'm not that hungry because I need to fit into this dress that I want to wear to that party, right? So let's talk the homeostatic mechanism. The following figure that we're going to see here in a little bit is an overview to illustrate the interrelationship between the 7 core processes that constitute the fundamentals of regulation. So if you're prepared for relatively complex diagram, good on you, right? The mechanisms are physiological needs, psychological drive, homeostasis, right? Negative feedback, multiple inputs, multiple outputs, intra-organismic mechanisms, extra-organismic mechanisms, all the stuff we've discussed. Let's put them together in a single model. And there you go. Does anything more need to be said? Probably not, huh? You got it? Okay. No, not really. All right, come on, let's go back and let's kind of unpack some of this. So here is the current internal state, right? That's where we'll begin up top here. Why not? In current internal state, right, is a result of the neural, hormonal, physiological, intra-organismic mechanisms that monitor and regulate homeostasis. And homeostasis is achieving the balance, right? Now, if the internal conditions, if we see low, then the negative feedback signals satiety. So if I was thirsty, if something's telling me I'm thirsty, but my thirst is diminishing, internal conditions are low, negative feedback says, you know, you're not so much thirsty anymore. The negative feedback is saying you've consumed liquid and we're going to shut the system off. Multiple outputs, behaviors taken to decrease internal state to reach homeostasis. That is, I'm going to stop drinking. But let's check the other side. Internal conditions are high, right? This then, boy, thirst conditions, that is some analysis of the blood or other mechanisms like dryness in the mouth might be another one. When you feel your mouth is dry, you want to consume liquid, you become thirsty to wet your mouth. So if the internal conditions are high, it represents a psychological need that activates the drive. This is where we're beginning to realize we're thirsty, and then multiple output behaviors are taken to increase the internal state to reach homeostasis. That is, I am dehydrated. Homeostatically, I'm no longer balanced as to my liquid content. I'm dehydrated, right? So in fact, then I'm going to drink to satisfy. So thirst then, or hunger, whatever, follows this general model. Notice, when we assess that the imbalance is low, that we're coming into balance, then that signal says you're satisfied, stop whatever it is you're doing. But as we become imbalanced, that is, internal conditions are high, then the drive is activated and we engage in behaviors to return to homeostasis. Okay? So, thirst from physical deprivation then, well, what do? You deprive rats, and poor rats have been so helpful in so many psychological studies, right? Rats were deprived of water for 24 hours. And then what do? Well, if we provide intracellular replacement, right, what we see then is as we inject water into the rats, this intracellular replacement, they drank less. Extracellular replacement, their thirst remains essentially equal, right? So thirst in this example is largely a function of dehydrated cells. So when cells experience moisture replacement at that cellular level, then it reduces the thirst, right? So this system is just one system that affects our sense of thirst. Okay? Now, thirst then, the process is the physiological regulation that causes thirst activation. What else is operating? Thirst satiety, the satisfaction. The hypothalamus and liver are implicated in the monitoring of these systems, and environmental influences. My poor cat Pigpen, right? In fact, poor guy, he had kidney issues, you know, and what was happening is his kidneys and liver were not processing water, you know, correctly, and not doing with the water, because he drank a ton of water, but it had little to no effect, right? So we talked with the vet, you know, and it's like, well, he's not going to go on like this very long. He will die as a result of this problem with his organs. And the recommended treatment at this point, the vet said, if you're willing to do this, is what we can do is we can use replacement. That is, we can give him an IV, and it ended up I would give Pigpen subcutaneous fluids every day. 100 mils of saline every day, right? So I had my IV bag You know, and I'd pick that up at the vet, like every 10 days, here's your IV bag, it's good for 10 treatments, 100 mils each, and I would take Pigpen and sit him on the table, and then I would pick his skin up right here, right, and stick the needle in. I know, that was creepy. I learned to do that and thought nothing of it. Stick the needle in, give him 100 mils of fluid, and it would absorb into his body and replenish. That was the only way that it would occur in this regard. Pigpen took that treatment for 2 years. The vet was amazed. He said, I never thought that the cat would last this long. And after a while, it just stopped being effective, and it was time to let him go. But 2 years of great life as a result of this replenishment, right? This replenishment of saline into a system. So thirst satiety, how and when does the organism become sated? That is, how and when does the organization? Well, there's really three components here. So the mouth, the stomach, and the cell. I think with Pigpen, what we're doing is obviously operating at the cellular level. We're seeing cellular replacement that then reduces or meets the needs. But the mouth, so when you're thirsty, notice there's really kind of three areas in which could be signaling that you need to be thirsty. And that is dryness of the mouth, it could be emptiness of the stomach, or it could be the loss of liquid at a cellular basis. Right. So let's not forget the hypothalamus as well as the kidneys and liver. But basically, when we look at these three, we can explain the source of thirst. Now, the hypothalamus monitors the kidney state via analyzing the blood, right, and makes a thirst message conscious to the prefrontal cortex. That's the general way that it happens, right? The hypothalamus says, wow, I'm not satisfied with the water level. Homeostatically, we've reduced, we're entering into the level of dryness that then sends the corrective message to the brain, you need to drink, experience thirst, right? So, now, this is not the only reason we drink, though, right? Because drinking, sometimes we drink out of the pleasure of drinking. And then, so we can compare, we can look at the incentive value, because then a liquid has an incentive. That is, we realize, boy, this is tasty, or boy, I like this. That also has a motivational property that we want to do it simply because we like it, not simply because we're thirsty and driven to it. So when we introduce this additional layer, this incentive layer, what we see here is that the incentive layer of water that's been made bitter is quite low. You know, we might drink a little, but it's like, oh, this is bitter, I don't want to carry on with that. Might drink just enough to achieve homeostasis, but stop drinking after that. Salt and sour, you can see pretty much on the same path, but unfortunately for us human beings, we love sweet, right? We've come to love sweet. So sweet tasting beverages, right, can be consumed in a greater and greater extent. And 7-Eleven and various convenience stores know this. When the big gulp came on stage, I don't know how many of you have maybe had the opportunity to travel to Europe. You travel to Europe and you order a Coke, and what do? They bring out a 6 or 8 ounce bottle of Coke, and you look at that shit and you go, that's a gulp. That's one gulp. I will down that almost as before the waitress even leaves the table, right? So, because we become used to this sweet or artificially sweetened massive gulps, like 54 ounce, 64 ounce cup of soda, right? It takes us far beyond our level of biological satiety because of the incentive value of the sweetness of the flavor somehow. So, notice that no one explanation is probably good enough to explain the observed behavior. It's usually multiple. So thus drinking is in response to thirst-related water replenishment. That's the need. We need to maintain a balance of moisture in our body. But non-thirst related sweet taste is the incentive. So we can have both of these operating simultaneously. And non-thirst related attraction, addiction to a substance in the water, no, that could be then alcoholic drinks, right? That, in fact, the addictive potential. So if we see drinking, we say, well, why is that person drinking? Well, it could be because they need to replenish moisture in their body. It could also be that they like drinking, there's a high incentive value. And it could be third, depending on what they're drinking, maybe what they're drinking has addictive properties. And this could be both alcohol, but some people also argue that it could be sugar in the water as well. So, when we want to explain drinking behavior, we have several sources, and these sources can interact. They can be all present at the same time. Let us talk hunger. So what do we know about hunger? Well, hunger, processes involved in hunger. We might have short-term appetite. We might have long-term energy balance as a component. Let's look at a comprehensive model of hunger regulation. But environmental influences, as we're present with thirst, are present in hunger. We have restraint-release situations, and we'll explain that. Cognitively regulated eating style, and weight gain, obesity, set point, or is it settling points, right? So we'll have to move through all this terminology. And how you guys feeling? You want another diagram? Let's do another diagram. So here's the promised diagram, comprehensive model of hunger regulation, right? So we see up here eating, energy intake, and it's required, right? And environmental influences, food variety, appearance, situational pressures. I grew up, I was adopted, but at birth or just shortly after birth. And my adopted dad's side of the family, Polifrones, where I got my name. His name sounds a little Italian. What do you think? Oh, my dad's mother, Nona, my grandmother, was from the old country. She came to the United States from Italy around 1900, 1903, right? Like so many Italian Americans, trace our origins to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and came to the United States as a child to make a better life. And but boy, she could cook, that's for sure. And Italian food was the name of the game there. She baked bread virtually every day. She was up at 4:30 in the morning, starting to bake bread. She also made her own, pasta sauce, and the smells that arised from the Polifrone kitchen, from Nona's kitchen, were absolutely incredible. And she's that stereotypical Italian grandmother, and this is a grandmother that's typical across many ethnicities, not just Italian. But that's what and you walk in the door, right? And you haven't been in the door 10 minutes before she's trying to stuff some food in your face, right? So eat more. If you're sitting at the dinner table, how about another plate, right? How about some more of this? And the food is so good, right? So the food variety, the appearances, the situational pressures, eat. And you know what it's like in holidays. I mean, when I moved out of the house, I was 17 years old, by 18, Christmas Day in Los Angeles, what do? Well, I go to my girlfriend's house and eat there. And then I stop by my mom's house and have something to eat there. And then I go to Nona's house and I have something to eat there. And it's like by the end of Christmas, by the end of Thanksgiving, whichever holiday it is, notice that these are largely holidays that are central to my upbringing, but other ethnicities and religions share different holidays, but often the common theme is eating. And you go from holiday to holiday to holiday. And by the end of Christmas, I feel like I can't even move because I've had so much to eat. Because if I don't eat, if I say, I've already had 2 Christmas dinners, I'm really full, thanks but no thanks, then I'm going to hurt the feelings of the host at that given moment. So we eat, right? And these are environmental influences. Maybe it's the variety. Maybe it's the appearance. Oh my God, that looks good, Your stuff from dinner, but then bring out this amazingly marvelous dessert, and you go, I can't eat another bite, but that looks so good, I'm going to have to, right? So, but to the extent now notice those actually increase, but the self-regulation motivation. Look, if you're a calorie counter, you get to the point where you said, I've done about 2,300 calories today, and I'm trying to stick to about 1,400. I'm already like 900 calories over. No more eating for me today. That is my ability to self-regulate the motivation. I might want to eat, but I have this self-regulation motivation that says, no, you shouldn't eat anymore. Now, what else is going on? Well, fat stores and the way your body stores fat and what it requires in terms of what it believes is the necessary fat. Now, exercise motivation, right? This is, to what extent do we believe it's important to exercise, and often to enhance our body shape, or at least to make ourselves healthier. There's other reasons to exercise, obviously, as well. So the energy expenditure. So eating is the energy intake. Physical activity, then, is the energy expenditure. Notice that this can be affected by exercise motivation, this by self-regulation, right? Now, fat stores, as they tend to diminish, will cause then hunger, which then motivates eating behavior, right? But as we eat, notice then there's negative feedback that says, oh, you're eating, you're becoming full, and that diminishes your hunger. Okay? Questions about that? And notice that this is then affected by the fat stores as well. Questions? This is essentially a simple model of how hunger is associated with these other factors. So, environmental influences that affect eating behavior. Hey, the time of day, stress. How many of you eat because it's the time I always eat at this time, right? And notice that your hunger almost becomes programmed. You eat at this time, right? But notice that there's other environmental factors besides time of day. How many of you are stress eaters? I mean, I'm sure there's some of you who, when you're stressed out, you feel better as a result of eating, right? How many of you, though, are kind of the flip side? When you're under stress, you lose your appetite. Strange, huh? And the sight, the smell, the appearance, and the taste of food can all then cause us to want to eat or eat more. Now, eating behavior increases significantly, for instance, when an individual confronts a variety of foods, a variety of nutrients, and a variety of tastes. Boy, I don't even remember the last time I was to a buffet, because we don't go out because of the pandemic, etc. But, you know, I'm a buffet freak. You know, go to a buffet and what is available. Man, look at, oh my God, there's all these different types of meat and proteins, if you will. There's these vegetables, these salads, right? And it's like, oh my God. But notice, for many of us who like the buffet style meals, we eat probably 2 or 3 times as much as we need to, because it's just so good, and the variety itself becomes an enticement for those who appreciate the variety. Now, let's take a look at this empirically, and this is a pretty straightforward study. What we do is we craft a social setting. So we have people being randomly assigned to one of 4 different conditions. The first condition is whether they're alone or whether they're then being served with 3 others. And then the second condition is the number of flavors available, either 1 or 3. So this allows us then 4 cells, right, in our experimental condition. And what do we see then? Well, what we're trying to then look at is the number of grams, and we see that someone who is alone, a male who is alone, right, with 1 flavor, 113.8 grams consumed. But check it out. If that same male is alone, not the same male, but you know what I'm saying, and there's 3 flavors available, we see the variety factor here going from 1 to 3 increases consumption significantly by about 80%, right? And we see, though, interestingly, with 3 others, we see the initial amount of consumption is much higher with a single element, but with variety, it drops down. And then we see essentially the same pattern here with females and the different pattern with females here. What we see, though, is an overall increase when we're eating with other people and when variety is available to us, all else being equal. So these become interesting factors in the prediction of, will I eat more than I normally would? Well, if I'm with others, the general answer might be yes, right? And if there's increased variety, maybe so as well. Things to consider. If we want to then limit how much we eat, we might use that as advice. Okay. Now, satiety and food type. Protein, fat, fiber produces greatest satiation potential. Generally, the simple rule is the longer it takes to digest, the longer it's hanging out, and the longer before I feel hungry again. I mean, to put it in totally non-scientific terms, right? So they provide the greatest satiation potential. Now, simple carbohydrates are the least satisfying because simple carbohydrates are digested most rapidly. And also, the interesting thing about simple carbohydrates, how many people believe that a cereal like shredded wheat is good, healthy food? And in certain ways of looking at it, it is a healthy food. But when we look at this idea of glycemic index, that is when I eat a food, how long does it take the sugar in the food to make it into the bloodstream? And foods with a high glycemic index are digested quickly and just hammer the bloodstream with sugar in a real rapid fashion. So, and it's compared to table sugar, right? So we can take the glycemic index of table sugar and eat sugar and then see how fast it shows up in the blood. But a cereal like shredded wheat, a wheat-based cereal, and it's most of these grain, highly refined grain types that have higher glycemic index than actual sugar, because they're processed so quickly and they put a huge sugar dump on us. So simple carbohydrates, which is a component of, a huge number of fast foods and junk foods, are largely simple carbohydrates, and they really have devastating glycemic indexes. They're really dangerous in that regard. And this leads, it interacts with the prevalence of type 2 diabetes to a great extent. So let's talk about the glucostatic hypothesis then, which is talking in terms of blood sugar. This is a short-term mechanism. When plasma glucose levels fall, that is, the level of sugar in the blood falls, right, the lateral hypothalamus, who's monitoring the blood, says, hey, sugar in the blood's falling, right? The ventromedial hypothesis decreases the hunger. So it's this drives us, this supplies then the need. Boy, you need more sugar in your blood, and it drives you to seek out foods that will replace it. Okay? And this is why simple carbohydrates then spike the glucose level, but they diminish rapidly and then cause us to be hungry again for the glucostatic hypothesis. That's one hunger mechanism that operates intraorganismically. Now, stomach distension. The stomach, all else being equal, can process about 210 calories per hour, right? High-calorie foods then get processed more slowly. Interesting, right? So fullness matters. And what this means is the stomach and its contents, you're able to assess the contents of the stomach. Once the stomach's about 90% full, there's no more hunger signal that originates via the stomach and its processes. So we don't have to eat till we're stuffed, right? We just have to eat till we're 90% full if we're worried about our eating habits. At 60% full, right, what we see now is a hint of hunger. And then finally, at 10% full, essentially empty, very hungry. So, implied weight control strategy out of this, if that's important to us, eat to about 80% full, right? Eat till you feel satisfied. And also, this mechanism takes time to monitor itself. That's why we're told to eat slowly and eat to satisfaction. So notice, if I eat slowly, then I'll hit 80% full, and I'll recognize if I'm eating slowly, yeah, I'm satisfied, I'm good, I can stop now. If I eat rapidly, right, then I'm going to get overfilled, and by the time it says you've had enough, I've already gone beyond that point and had too much, right? So eat slowly and eat to feeling satisfied rather than stuffed. I know, easier said than done. And when I say these things, I understand the difficulty in this. Look, I've struggled with my weight off and on throughout my life. And so for many of us, this is a battle that will be something that we will live with for the rest of our lives. Now let's look at the lipostatic hypothesis. So again, we've had the glucostatic, we've had stomach distension, and now our third hypothesis for hunger, the lipostatic. And this is a long-term mechanism, and this is similar to a set point hypothesis. Fat cells are monitored. and the fat cells are monitored. So as the fat cells gain additional stores, they get bigger and they say, you know, I don't need to eat so much, right, over time. But as they begin to shrink, as they begin to diminish, the fat cells are these greedy little guys, and they send out the message, hey, I'm shrinking. I need to eat more. You eat more, so I will expand, right? So the fat cells, if the level drops too low, adipose tissue secretes the hormone ghrelin, right? Ghrelin causes the experience of hunger. So as ghrelin is being released into the blood by the fat cells, then the hypothalamus says, dude, you need to eat. Ghrelin alert, right? Here's the problem when we diet. Dieting, deprivation diets, right, signals the body to produce more ghrelin. That is, as we diet, what we're hoping is that the fat cells shrink. But the problem is, as the fat cells shrink, they're releasing more ghrelin into the bloodstream, which makes us hungrier. So diets cause people to be hungry. And how many of you have been on a diet where you say, God, I hate that diet because I feel hungry all the time? And this is usually the result of attempting short-term dietary control to lose fat, right? And it's unlikely to work. If we want to lose fat, we really got to be kind of in it in the long term, and we got to be super gradual about it, right? So, now the hormone leptin signals that the body is full, right? So leptin is like, hey, you've had enough. So notice, what we have is this homeostatic mechanism. Too little fat, ghrelin is released, increasing hunger. When the fat levels have reachieved or rebalanced, then leptin shuts off the eating behavior. Right? So, unfortunately, and you say, well, then what the hell? Oh my God, I'm no genius, but just give me some leptin. I'll take leptin. I'll take leptin every moment of the day, because if I take leptin, then I won't feel hungry and I can successfully diet, which has been tried. So it's been tried, and unfortunately we developed tolerance to leptin quickly. So the promise as a weight loss treatment was never realized in this regard. And there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, I guess, if we're talking food here, right? So tonsed off on that for a minute or two. Now, other than surgery, 3 ways people can prevent or reverse weight loss, gain, and obesity. So, self-regulation of food intake, that is, we got to learn to develop, I hate the term, the willpower, right? That's self-regulatory process to push the plate of food away or to create a smaller plate, right? So, if we want to, over the long term, reverse weight gain, move away from obesity, we're going to have to find some system, and this is going to be individualized, right, where we can enhance our self-regulation, our self-regulatory prowess in this regard. So we decrease eating through strategies. They can be setting goals for ourselves, monitoring one's calorie intake, monitoring one's behavior, right? If I want to lose weight, then I got to stay out of the buffet, right? I shouldn't be eating fast food, right? So, now exercise motivation, and you know, people have reminded us again and again and again that you know, one of the pillars of weight loss is to increase physical activity. That is simply to burn more calories. And basically what we're trying to do in those top 2 is say, I am going to eat less, that is, I'm going to consume less, so my calorie intake goes down, and I'm going to exercise more, so my burning of calories goes up, right? So we have to develop some way to motivate ourselves to exercise, right? Expend more calories and whittle away on those fat stores. Now, the mindfulness is how we have our own back. We say, God, what are my associations? What are my trigger points? What are the things that cause me to overeat? And I got to start re-engineering my life. I got to start taking control of my environment so that I'm not fighting an uphill battle, that things become a little easier. So become aware and monitor the environmental influences that affect eating. So if you're like me and you want to drop a few pounds and the psychology department sends you that email, hey, Joe and Doe, remember those? Coffee and donuts in the lobby of the psychology building. What do I got to do? Well, I either got to come in the back entrance so I don't go by the donuts, right? Or I got to come in a little later, or whatever it is, right? I got to find some way then maybe to just shape my path so that it doesn't intersect with donuts. Because it's not doing me any good, right? It's not doing this waistline any good. So, now, I've committed to becoming healthier over the last year here. You know, I've been putting on weight like crazy since the pandemic, because what is there to do, or where is there to go, right? So I've got the exercise under control. I've been working out 5-6 hours a day, dusted off the Bowflex, good to go on that. There's a bicycle down there. I don't like riding the exercise bike as much as I like the Bowflex. I like weightlifting more than aerobic. That's fine, but the eating is still kind of problematic. Not eating a lot of horrible foods necessarily, but not still eating too much, I guess. Well, that should be obvious, right? So mindfulness is going to help with this. Questions about that? So we've talked about thirst and the different sources of thirst. We've talked about hunger and the different sources of hunger. And the reason to understand those is to develop strategies so that we can achieve our goals more and more readily. I was going to say easily, but I don't know that there's anything easy about it. Let's say more and more readily. All right, we're about time to talk about the sex drive. All right, the physiological regulation, facial metrics, again, processes that are involved in this. And notice each of these drives has had this list of processes. Sexual scripts, sexual orientation, evolutionary basis of sexual motivation, right? So let's take a look. The typical sexual response cycle that describes men's sexual motivation so well. And it's the triphasic model, right? That is, desire is activated, and desire is translated into arousal. Arousal then leads to orgasm, and then it is a matter of resolution. So for men, and I know we like to joke about men are relatively simple in this regard, and there's probably a lot of truth to that, at least more than a kernel of truth. So that's a traditional sexual response cycle, and remember, because we've come out of an inherently sexist world, when people were talking about sex drives, they were almost always referring to the male pattern of drive and response and resolution. Females, weren't even supposed to experience pleasure or enjoy sex or any of that good stuff if we go back 100 years for Western society. Other societies might have looked at it a little differently. Now let's look at the intimacy-based model of sex drive that describes women's sexual motivation as being inherently more complex. Right? So this alternative then starts essentially with intimacy needs, which is a psychological rather than a physical need, right? And the intimacy need then, right, seeks out and is receptive to sexual stimuli on the basis of this intimacy. From there, then, the biological and physiological factors affect the processing of the stimuli, and if all is good in that area, right, all is consistent, then sexual arousal might occur. Upon sexual arousal, then the sexual desire continues, and more arousal, pleasure, positive outcome emotionally and physically is the enhancement of the intimacy. So note, a far different model than the triphasic model that would be attributed to men, at least stereotypically, right? So, what do we walk away with? Well, we've compared a relatively simple model to a more complex model. And let us then just kind of summarize, if you will. We need a joke every now and again, and who knows, maybe, I don't think it's offensive, but you be the ultimate. So if we want to compare male versus female sexual responsiveness, or at least if we want to compare across gender perceptions of the other gender, and I'm talking obviously in heterosexual terms here, then maybe we end up with something like this. Yeah, alright, it's a stereotype. I hope it was funny. And if I offended, not my intent, let us then talk about sexual scripts, sexual schemas. Now, this also has an effect on sexuality and sex drives. That is a mental representation of a typical sexual episode. So this is what we learn as we're growing up. This is what we acquire. Although I gotta wonder what it's like growing up now as what it was like growing up 40 years ago. And let's face it, it's a big difference, because children now essentially have access to every kind of pornography available on the planet. And to me, that strikes us so different. And you know, I'm not a researcher in this area, so if you take human sexuality, I'm sure they discuss this in that class. Let's let Cravens Brown handle this, because I would be too embarrassed probably to discuss it in any level of detail. Man, when I was growing up, you know, when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, us guys, my small group of friends, if someone found a Playboy, that thing, you know, that was like, oh my God, look at, we found a Playboy, right? And oh my God, you know, this is like the world of exposure to sex in the 1960s, right? And that's a little different to have a single magazine with X number of pages, etc. Much different than what's available on the internet. So how did we learn to represent sexual episodes? How did we develop sexual scripts? Was probably a very narrow conceptualization compared to sexual scripts that could be developed today, right? Now, part of, you know, that's the sexual scripts, the step-by-step explanation of the episode, right? The sexual schema is my view of myself as a sexual actor or sexual being. And that is the perception of me within the domain context of having sex, right? Partner compatibility is really kind of influenced at a social level, a combination of the both, right? What is the script and how do I believe the sex act should be arrived at, right? And who am I in terms of participating in that sexual script? So that really, if my partner and I both look at this kind of in a compatible way, then the sexual fulfillment should be higher, all else being equal. Okay. From there, we go to facial metric parameters. What do we know here? Well, facial metrics is an interesting study, and that is, it looks at the inherent appeal, and in this case sexual appeal, based on facial characteristics, kind of global facial characteristics. Now, neonatal, that is resembling infants, and we see in many creatures and humans, babies are so damn cute, right? And they got this little nose, right? And they got these big eyes, and it makes us want to interact with them intimately, to pick them up, to cuddle them, to hold them, to soothe them, to nurture them, to be around them, right? And what is being transmitted here? Well, it's youth and agreeableness are really what are at the bottom line. So, and this leads to this idea of biophilia. That is, and we'll look at the book by that title here in just a second, that these are largely engineered or hardwired, right? Or at least cultural aspects that are deeply ingrained in us, right? But these cause us to then want to nurture offspring. But it also might make people more physically attractive, depending on, you know, our culture, but as an overarching kind of process that oversees the evolutionary components. Sexual maturity features. What demonstrates sexual maturity then is prominent cheekbones, and in males, thick eyebrow and facial hair. So these signal things like strength, status, and competency, really at an evolutionary level. Expressive features, wide mouth, smile, higher set eyebrows, right, as demonstrating higher levels of power, if you will, right, and happiness and openness. Now, who studies this kind of stuff? Well, Biophilia is a book by Edward E.O. Wilson. I love this book. I've read a couple of Wilson's books. He's a sociobiologist. I think he coined the term of sociobiology, and he really is an evolutionary theorist. And he looks at how evolution, the demands of evolution, drive our social processes. Right? Fascinating story about ants in this book, leafcutter ants, and how they function as a society, right? And how they know their roles and how they know their places, But enough about ants. When we talk about human beings, what makes one person look more sexually attractive and under what circumstances? So, gender differences in mate preference, well, let's then, and again, evolutionary theory, there'll be exceptions, but the variable, physical appearance, the person is good looking. How important is it? Well, greater preference for men, and this is heterosexual a table here, right? What we're looking at is, so men then think that physical appearance of a potential partner is more important than women do, right? And we can see then the numbers there, 3.59 to 2.58. And this is on a scale of 1 to 7. So a single point difference on a scale of 1 to 7 with an adequate n, which this is, right, is a pretty significant difference. We would, need at least half a point difference on a 1 to 7 scale between two conditions, but a full point difference generally guarantees statistically significant difference. Age. So for men, right, is younger than me by 5 years. That's important to men, right? Greater preference for men. Is older than me by 5 years. What we see, greater preference from women than for men, right? Earning potential. Holds a steady job. Much more important for women than for men, so the preference is for women there. Partner earns more than me. Greater preference for women. Has more education than me. Greater preference for women, that the man is more highly educated, which is a surrogate for earning potential. Except not always the case. Look at my wife and I, right? She's got a bachelor's degree and a paralegal certificate. She's actually got 2 bachelor's degrees, right? And of course, I have the PhD, the master's degree, the bachelor's degree, all that happy horse shit, right? And she earns about 80% more than I do. So, give or take, right? Other variables: has been married before. Doesn't represent any significant gender difference. It's not part of the mate-seeking equation, I don't think. Has children? Well, greater preference for women, but notice it's 2.84 to 3.11. So significant difference, but not as significant as the other differences we see. But you ask yourself, okay, so why would women value a man who has had children more so than a man would value a woman who's had children? And let's face it, if I'm a man and I've had children, then I demonstrate that, first of all, I'm capable of doing it, but perhaps a better deal as far as a potential parent for her children. Is of a different religion than me? There's no significant gender difference in that one in mate selection. Is a different race than me? Greater preference for men over women, so go figure that. I don't know what to take away from that. Now, extraorganismic. For good times, bad times. Pettyjohn developed the environmental security hypothesis, which he first suggested at the University of Georgia with Abraham Tesser. And the research proposed that when people lose confidence in the economy, they tend to prefer more mature characteristics, which seems to provide some psychological security. So in this case, they have this funny graph here, and take with it as you will, right? This is not maybe the most solid, but hard times versus eye width of popular country singers. And what we see is times get harder, eye width of singers as it increases, those singers preference for those singers increases. I think there's probably, and you can maybe imagine better ways to get at this study, but it's kind of cute in that regard as well. But again, remember, strength, power, etc. is equated to these facial characteristics at a very low level, at an evolutionary, non-conscious level, if you will. So, reflect on it. We've talked about thirst, we've talked about hunger, and we've talked about the sex drive. We've talked throughout about the notion of regulatory challenges, and I think we need to return to that idea now and kind of finish up talking regulatory challenges. There's Desi, just in case you were wondering. He often feels it's important to air out his belly. I guess that's what he's doing. So this is a very comfortable posture for Desi. Desi came here as a kitten. He was out on the porch, and I couldn't resist him. He'd already been neutered. Saw the clipped ear, right? So I brought him inside. We adopted Desi, and he's been here ever since. He's a real lover. How did Desi get his name? Desi reminds me of Desi Arnaz from Lucy and Desi, the Lucille Ball show. It was actually the episode where Lucy was pregnant and going to have her baby. And Desi Arnaz, the father of the baby, worked in a nightclub, and he was preparing for an act, a rehearsal, where he dressed up as a headhunter, right? And showed up in the hospital like that. So all very humorous, etc. But he just always reminded me of Desi. So Desi is Desi, and yes, we do have a Lucy in this house as well. So both Desi and Lucy are represented here. I know, you didn't need to know that. I hope you fast-forwarded through it. Failures to self-regulate physiological needs. People that fail at self-regulation, and get ready for your homework assignment. People fail at self-regulation for 3 primary reasons. 1, people routinely underestimate how powerful motivational force biological urges can be when they're not currently experiencing them. So I make all the plans in the world. I can control my hunger by doing such. And that sounds really good until I'm frickin' hungry. And once I'm hungry, it's like, oh my God, I had a real simple solution to this problem, but no, it's not adequate because I'm experiencing this hunger. So we often underestimate. I can do this. I can lose weight. Failing to consider, right, how powerful hunger might be. So we also might then, and this is the second potential reason that we could fail at self-regulation or fall short of our self-regulation goals, right? We might lack standards, or they have inconsistent, conflicting, unrealistic, or inappropriate standards, that it just doesn't make sense. So I decide that I can control my calorie intake in a certain way, but it's unrealistic. Well, I'll just not eat. And it's like, well, no, you're going to have to eat. You can't just not eat, right? And then finally, people fail to monitor what they're doing as they become distracted, preoccupied, overwhelmed, or intoxicated. And obviously intoxication, our self-regulation strategies largely go to hell. But it's like, after a drink or two, then maybe, I promised myself I wasn't going to eat a platter full of wings, but after my 3rd beer, a platter full of wings sounds pretty damn good, and I've lost my ability to inhibit that desire, right? So any one of these 3 can short-circuit our ability to engage in regulatory processes to which we've committed, and maybe committed too strongly, right? So I want to make this homework 2, and what we're going to do then is describe and apply self-regulatory failures. What does this mean to future control attempts? And we often set these goals for us. I'm going to lose weight, or I'm going to stop drinking, or I'm going to do my homework, or whatever it is. But here's how I want us to go down with homework 2. I want one team member to write a short scenario in which an actor is confronted with a potential self-regulation challenge. And I think one of the easiest ones to go out here, and kind of probably the most universal for this assignment, would be a diet of some sort that requires resisting eating too much of a certain type of food. But the example is largely up to you, right? Other scenarios are certainly possible. Quitting smoking might be another one, right? But I think eating is probably the best way to go. Key to writing the scenario that your teammates will use for the assignment is that allows all 3 regulatory failures to be applied to the scenario. So you discuss the assignment, and one of your team members says, I'm willing to write the scenario if that's okay with you guys. So now you write this realistic scenario that represents potential regulatory failure. So whoever assumes this role has got to be the most proactive person on your team, right? Because they got to get it done quickly so that others, the 3 other teammates, how many ever have time to then write their responses, right? So again, what we have is one person writing the scenario, the other 3 team members respond to it. So 3 team members then each choose one of the 3 reasons for regulatory failure, and that is from the previous slides, either number 1, number 2, or number 3, right? And describe how they apply to the scenario. So first student writes the scenario, and then the next 3 of you agree, I'm going to take regulatory failure number 1, someone else, I'll take number 2, and then finally the 3rd person says, I'll take number 3. The last teammate now offers 3 suggestions to count. Got it? All right. So then let's go back here. So what we're going to do now, someone has written the scenario, they volunteered to do that, and then I say, well, I'll take the underestimate, and I'll write an example of that to the scenario. The second person says, well, I want to tackle the standards one, so I'm going to write a response like that. The third person says, I'm going to take on the third, right? And now, if you have 5 team members, right? Finally, the last teammate, number 5, offers 3 suggestions to counter each of the 3 failures of self-regulation. So they write kind of the prescription of how do you avoid, or how do you avoid that self-regulatory fail. Now, notice, this is a suggested division of labor. You may decide to do it differently. That's up to you. And remember, the first person's got to be the most proactive. That is, they got to get the scenario written as soon as possible so other people have time to consider it and respond to it. And then those people got to be pretty proactive as well, because they got to give the last person time to respond to each of the 3. Okay? So you can see with these team assignments, it's not just as simple as, hey, I'm going to do 1, you do 2, I'm going to do 3. It's like, if I do 1, I am committing and I'm willing to motivate myself to get off the dime and get it done as quickly as possible. And then the 3 people in the middle, they're like, yeah, we've committing to do this in a timely manner to give our 5th person, our final person, at least 2 days to get this done. So always work backwards from the due date and figure it out from there. This is another level of complexity that I'm adding on to these assignments. And especially for the course of motivation, if you ain't up to snuff, that is, if you're procrastinating on this bullshit, then I want you to take it as an opportunity to say, why the hell am I screwing myself over? And why the hell am I screwing my teammates over? Right? We're in this together. Be it doing these assignments in this class, or we're in this together doing this assignment called life on the planet. So, there you go. Okay? And if you don't have a 5th person, what might you do? Well, you could email me and you say, we don't have a 5th person. Do we have to do the whole assignment? You could email me and ask that, right? And if you feel that strongly about it, then don't do this last part. Or, you know what you could do? Is you could split up that last part between the 4 of you. It's up to you. You take your choice. And remember that you got to indicate on the assignment, you know, if someone's missing, if they didn't respond, let me know. If you only have 4 people, let me know. Just let me know what's going on, so either the course assistant or I, whoever's grading this particular assignment, so we know what the hell's going on, we know how to handle it easily. And again, please use your first and last names throughout, you know, the worksheet, etc., that's available to you. It makes it easier for us to do the grading and move through more efficiently. The more efficient we are about grading, right, the easier you make it on us, the more quickly we get it done, and the quicker that you get the feedback on the assignment, or you get to watch your points accrue, right, for those of you who enjoy doing that. So let's work together on this. And I know it's largely new for you guys, and it's super new for us as well, right? So as we're working through this together, let's find ways to just make it better for everybody. And we're going to close. Adios to Boots, right? Boots is so Boots that I said her name twice. And Boots is my good buddy. She's probably the senior cat in the house now. Hard to know. Maybe Mama is. I don't know. Maybe Boots is. But there she is. And Boots' favorite posture is for me to sit down, put my legs out on the table, and then she'll lay on my crossed legs. And the interesting thing is she'll only lay on my legs if I cross my left over my right. If I cross my right over my left, Boots goes, no, I'm not going to sit there like that. So, and this goes way back when I first brought Boots into the house years and years ago, and she was obviously very pregnant. She was in quarantine in a separate room, and I would go in and spend a couple hours with her every day. And what did she want me to do? Lay in the chair, sit in the chair and lay on my legs. And she was very pregnant, and it was very strange when she got really pregnant, right, to have her laying on my legs and feel those 6 kittens in her belly squirming around. That was like, and cool too. She had 6 kittens, and I found a home for all 6. Someone adopted all 6. So Good for Boots. And then she got spayed, and now she's just retired. As our veterinarian, Dr. Queller, says, once we get these moms spayed, these stray moms, they retire, and they enjoy their retirement. So there's Boots. You guys have a great day. Think about those self-regulatory challenges. If you have any questions about the homework, what are you going to do? That's right. Bring it to our class session. Bring it to office hours, and I'll be happy to explain it. And remember, your questions are so important for everybody else because other people have the same questions you do. So if you come to the Zoom session, you ask those questions, and then I remember to record it, right? Then it's available for other people who maybe had to work or take care of their loved ones during the pandemic, whatever, or both, right? So you guys have a great day. Talk to you later.